Hello, everybody, and welcome to People Always Ask. We're starting a little late today because I had some technical difficulties, but not to worry. A lot of people can catch it on the replay if they can't catch it on this first time around. So this episode is obviously kind of what we here at the Ordinary Healing Chantelle Doswell private practice specialize in, which is just trauma. And a lot of people actually hear the word trauma and they hear people go, well, that's a trauma symptom, but they're actually not really sure what trauma is and how to know if for some reason they've been traumatized or they're walking around with trauma themselves. So now that it's such a big buzzword and we know that trauma is not good, which of course all of us know on some level, what do we do? Because things like hearing that racism causes trauma for Black people by and large, or all people of color in America, that can be pretty concerning when we don't even know really what trauma means or what it's going to lead to. And so in the most simple definition of this, and this is just a bare minimum breakdown because a lot of people actually don't understand what trauma really means. All that trauma means is that you've been through something. And now this something might last for years and it might last for a day, but it just means that you've been through something. And now, when faced with reminders or fear of a reminder of the situation, you feel some type of way. Now, that might seem really overly simplistic, but honestly, y'all, that's all it is that when you've experienced something and you've experienced the reminders for it, your body feels some type of way. So obviously, there's a lot of different types of trauma. The most common one that people talk about is acute trauma, which means like I got robbed, I got into a car accident, I went through a shooting, there's a one-time event. That event is now causing you to feel some type of way in your body when there's reminders about it, right? That's our basic definition for it for everybody here. And so now I've been through this one thing. And for most people, when they've been through an acute trauma, it's pretty clear that the reminders are coming from that one thing. Now, here's what's a little more tricky. Most of us actually don't just have one thing that happened that one day, that one time, if we are experiencing trauma. We have what's called chronic trauma, which means like every time I walk down this block, people were doing X, Y, and Z and grabbing me or whatever. Or every time that I went home, right, there was a stepfather that I used to live with who was abusive to my mother. That would be an example of chronic trauma. Chronic means that it lasts for a long period of time, like a chronic illness. And chronic trauma has different symptoms, right, than regular acute trauma because you had to deal with it for a much longer period of time. And so when you think of how to survive it, that's a little bit more complicated than that one-time incident that an acute trauma survivor might have been through. One is not better or worse, right? It's just different in the way that they show up. The other type of trauma, which is not actually in the diagnostic manual for mental health right now, the DSM, is complex trauma. Complex trauma means that more than one thing has happened to you. And actually, most people and everybody that I work with, most people have complex trauma, even if they think that they just got one acute trauma. Complex trauma means that you've been through so many things that there's actually a lot of different ways that you show up, and there's a lot of different ways that you cope. So maybe you've been through violence and you've been through neglect and you've been through scary situations that have to do with you needing to fight. And you've been in situations where, you know, just America is unfair to you and you feel powerless. All those different things might bring out different parts of you. And so it becomes a little bit more complex. And so for most people, if they're experiencing systemic racism, right, on top of individual trauma, the type of trauma that they're going to end up having is complex. They're going to do some things because of some experiences and other things because of other experiences. It's not one straight line. The more complicated your trauma is, the more complex your trauma is, the harder it is to put your timeline together. So if we're asking the second part of this question, and do I have it? When we're thinking about complex trauma, if you have a hard time remembering what order things happen to you in, if you have a hard time remembering how old you were when things happen, or if you just have a whole part of your life that feels like it blanks out, or like there's actually blackouts and fuzziness around how did that happen and what happened first and did that really happen, that it's not organized in the way that it should be, that disorganization that you feel is actually a symptom of trauma because trauma makes it really difficult for our brain to organize things. One of the parts of the definition, right, of why when you experience something that your body feels the type of way on the reminder is because it overwhelms you. It's not something that you see coming enough or are prepared enough for to emotionally cope, and your body's not going to let you forget that. And so the more complicated your experience is, where there's more than one type of threat, more than one type of protection necessary, maybe sometimes I got to be a good girl and other times I need to fight people. Those have to be two separate parts of me that I get activated in different ways, or else I'm going to mess up and I'm not going to survive my own life. That's complex, right? But that's actually pretty common for a lot of people, especially a lot of Black people. Which brings us to this next part of trauma, which is generational trauma. People hear people talk about this, and a lot of times what they're talking about is epigenetics, right? Which means that they are passed on genetically coping and also genetically reminders of things that were harmful to people in their family before. And that's true. When they do studies of mice, actually, not people, because mice have really similar brains to people, what they find out is that if a mother has inherited harm and the harm response, if she's worried about it, what ends up happening is her kids inherit the same level of anxiety and alertness that she had because her stress levels are higher than a mother that wouldn't have been going through that trauma and stress. The good news is that if you learn coping, if you do better, your children also inherit that. So this isn't a one-directional thing where it's like your family can mess you up, but you can't undo it. If you learn to cope, coping is also passed down generationally. The other way that this works outside of just biologically is that symptoms of trauma tend to make it more likely that we're going to repeat traumatic cycles, right? So people will think that they're doing something different, trying to avoid the parents' mistakes. But if people don't really talk about it, so a really common example is that in families where sexual abuse happens, sometimes there will be a lot of different reasons why people didn't address it, why people didn't protect people. It might have a whole different reason for one parent than for another parent. But if effectively what is happening in this family is that children are getting hurt and parents and adults are not standing up and protecting them, that's a generational thing that needs to be corrected, because it means that underlying this family, there's some belief, there's some trauma that makes people think it's better to keep a secret, to hold this sort of stuff to yourself, than it is to tell people and try to get it resolved. Now, that makes a lot of sense in families where just 100 years ago, you couldn't call the police, let alone file a charge against somebody raping you who was white, or file a charge against somebody in your family without that completely destroying and betraying the community and family that you come from. That being said, some things in the Black community are generationally inherited coping, right? So things like over-policing your kids, because you're worried that if you don't do it, that they're going to get hurt or killed or hurt by somebody else, right? Also, these sort of ideas of if it happened to me, I guess it needs to happen to them because I turned out well. These are ideas that very well can keep up generational trauma, right? And then when they do studies on things like, getting beatings and things like that, especially with no messages behind the beatings, that the brain response is really the same as trauma. Right. So if we're having violence in the streets and violence in the homes, that gets passed down in the brain, too. So that also means systemic trauma, which can come from being put into a prison system that's oppressive, which can come from growing up in a system that really isn't fair to your family, which can come from housing disparities, which can come from health disparities, which can come from concentration camps. The system itself traumatizes people all the time. Now, if you've ever been down in the public assistance office, you know what I mean, because it is a traumatic experience to be spoken to and treated the way that people are treated down in that office, the way that it's a really traumatic experience for people to get out of prison and be spoken to the way that they are once they leave that system, after being dehumanized for however long by the system, right? Systemic trauma comes from the same overwhelm that acute and chronic trauma come from, right? That I've been through an experience with a whole system. It's not a person, it's not just one thing, where the system itself gave me such a response that I was overwhelmed emotionally. And now when I've run into that system, I feel some type of way, right? That's systemic trauma. Some of us might have systemic trauma right now from witnessing police shootings and witnessing people getting arrested and going to court cases that don't ever go anywhere. We're seeing court cases that don't turn out with just outcomes, right? Systemic trauma. All it is an overwhelm of your ability to cope with it. And so now you feel some type of way when you see the reminders. Even for me, something as simple as a week where somebody's talking about women's issues a lot in the news, especially an issue around a Black woman. For example, the week that T.I. went off and said all that nonsense about his daughter and checking her virginity, I actually had a physical shutdown response during that week because of all the criticism coming at Black women, because it was too redundant for the systemic trauma that I've already experienced of going into places and feeling like people had control over my body and I didn't. And that's individual, and that's chronic, and that's complex, and that's systemic. This is not just one thing or the other. So all these types of traumas exist, right? Where you can go through something, experience it, and then at the reminder, feel some type of way in your body, right? But how would you even know if you might be experiencing a trauma symptom, right? They're kind of sneaky. And so let's just talk about really quickly the symptoms of PTSD. For those of you who don't know, PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder, which means after something happens, there's a response that you have to the incident itself. In the DSM, they only define acute trauma as trauma, which means one thing happened, and so you have a response based on that one thing to those events, right? In reality, and with all the people that I work with, there's a lot of different ways that you can end up with these same symptoms. And so if we were really going to make it clear, you can have a lot of different symptoms related to several different traumas, but these are the kinds of things that are going to come up if for some reason your body is holding on to experiences or an experience that has not been resolved, that you haven't actually been able to heal from. And so this is what PTSD really is. And complex PTSD just means that it's more than one thing that you haven't healed from. It's a lot of pieces that need to get put together to organize this stuff. And so your body's going to be the first signal for PTSD. For most folks of color with depression, anxiety, and PTSD, their symptoms are very physical. They're not going to tell you, hey, I feel sad. That's not it, right? It's going to be, for some reason, I feel tired. For some reason, I can't eat. Digestive issues, things like that, right? Those are going to be the first symptoms. So when we're talking about these, we're going to talk about them in an emotional way, right? Like in terms of what you'd be thinking and feeling, but also in a physical way because they're tied together. One doesn't happen without the other. So the first symptom that you might notice is checking out from your body. This is kind of where depression and things like that can live. Dissociation is the fancy term for disconnect, right? And so disconnect can happen in a lot of different ways. Sometimes you can actually feel like you're like outside of yourself, watching yourself in a movie. Sometimes it can just feel like a very, very thick fog is around you and you're not totally in it. Sometimes you can feel like you're just sort of emotionally not present. Even though you're watching the stuff go by, it doesn't feel like anything. Your body's not connected to the actual sensations and joy or pain or anything about the experience, right? It's checked out. And so dissociation is known for a state of distance, right? That I can see myself and I kind of know I'm here, but the whole onboard experience of you being connected is not there. And so even with something like depression, one of the things they ask you is, well, are things that you used to enjoy not bringing you joy anymore? And that is a symptom of what we're talking about right here, is that you could have an experience where normally it would make you feel good. But when triggered, right, when you feel a reminder of something related to something that happened to you that's traumatic, you're going to put distance between those feelings and yourself, and they're going to be a little bit harder to feel, right? And so what you will feel is numbness, disconnection, this sort of vacant feeling in your body, right? And that is just as real as tears and sadness and crying when it comes to depression. That actually can be either one, right? Like you can have thoughts of maybe it would be better that I wasn't here in that same state because it's like, well, I'm not connected to anything anyway. This is kind of hopeless, which is where things like suicidality and things like that come into PTSD a lot because it doesn't feel like it's going to get better and you're not really connected. And you can also experience this next part at the same time, which is hypervigilance. Hypervigilance just means I'm checking my environment. I'm checking my sort of plan. I'm making sure that I am ready. Okay, because you're not going to catch me not on ready. And that's what trauma tells us, right? Is that this happens to me once, you're not going to catch this happening to me twice. right? Because if something puts our body in danger, it threatens something that we care about, it puts us in a life or death situation, or it puts us in a situation that's just disgusting and hard to process, what's going to end up happening is that we're going to be on high alert that anything about that day or that time that happened, that we're not going to let that happen again if we get any sort of clue that that's happening around us. So for some people who have experienced things like seeing somebody get hurt in public, when they walk past the same spot, they might be looking a little bit more closely at who's around them and what's going on. And now, I don't know why I didn't think of this sooner, but obviously the coronavirus is something that's actually traumatic for a lot of people, right? And so hypervigilance is something you might see a lot of people doing, maybe aggressively hypervigilant, right? That means you need to put on your mask, but also maybe we need to use hand sanitizer 4 or 5 times. We also need to make sure that we're not touching anything. We also need to make sure we hold our breath if anybody's walking by us. We also can't use the bus, and we also can't use the train, and we also can't, make sure that we're anywhere near anybody, no matter what or who they are, right? So we're isolating ourselves. Hypervigilance, right? That kind of worry about every little thing in your environment is a trauma symptom. And so even with something like the coronavirus, there's vigilance, which is appropriate for people to be looking at. And then there's people who you can tell, either because of this incident or one before it, feel the need to take it up a notch to what we would consider hypervigilance, where they're not only looking out, they're overly alert. They're overly concerned with the risks and what might be coming their way. And they're thinking 3 steps ahead of where they even are. And while that might keep them safe, emotionally, it is not a good place to be, which is why it's part of the PTSD symptoms, why it's part of trauma symptoms, because even after the danger is over, you're still here. You're still checking. You're still worried. You're still trying to figure out what the best way is to deal with this, even if there is no threat around you right now. Even if all the logical checks have been done, you're still checking. And that is absolutely disruptive for a lot of people. And it can be off-putting, right? That you feel like there's fear, even if there isn't really something to be scared of. The next thing that can happen is we can do a really great job of avoiding it in our lives, right? Where we're coping, we're meditating, we're doing all the things that we need to, and then we'll go to sleep and boom, nightmares. They don't even have to be nightmares about the trauma, ironically. Nightmares and dreams are interesting for a lot of reasons, but one of the most interesting things about them is that they actually prepare us for emotional experiences that they think that we'll need when we're awake. So a really strange thing that happens, for example, is that a person who's blind has a lot more nightmares than a person who is seeing most of the time, because there are more threats for a person who's blind. And so they need to be prepared for the threats, right? And so as unpleasant as it is that a person who couldn't see or was vision impaired would have more nightmares, it's also their brain telling them, we need to be prepared for a lot more uncertainty and a lot more anxiety than the average person, because we can't see, and this world is made for people who can see, right? With PTSD, similar situation. If I got caught slipping one time, my brain's going to be like, you know what, we need to rehearse that situation that got you caught, right? We need to replay that to make sure that you can understand where you went wrong. What was your fault? What wasn't your fault? What could you do differently? How can we survive knowing that this kind of thing happened to us? And so not only are the nightmares kind of a type of prep, so they don't have to actually be about the trauma experience. For example, like I had a client who had trauma, but they also had dreams of bees chasing them. And it wasn't really about the bees, right? It's about the experience of being out of control, of being pursued, of being trapped, of being in harm's way. Those are the kind of nightmares that can come along with what we call re-experiencing. Re-experiencing is funny because it's very much just about your body feeling the same way that it felt. It's not about you thinking anything. And so a lot of times people get very confused between thoughts and feelings, and trauma really takes advantage of that because your feelings don't speak English. So you're left trying to make sense of what might really just be your body going through a memory, right? And so in trauma, a lot of times what people say is that in trauma, symptoms are memories. And what they mean by that is that when something triggers you, you'll actually go into doing the same things, feeling the same ways, experiencing things the same way as the first original story that overwhelmed you, even if that's not really what's going on, right? And sometimes it will force you to repeat it. And so an example, even from just somebody I was talking to today, would be, I get really worried about losing my freedom because I was overly controlled as a child, right? So, like, let's say that my parent was really controlling, and now I have fears of being close to people, but I also don't want to be alone, right? What re-experiencing for a person who has childhood trauma like that, of being overly controlled, almost abusively so, can mean in a relationship is that the fun, bright, light, energetic version of them that exists when they're single starts to diminish over time as they get into close relationships with somebody who is controlling in any reason, in any light, right? And so that reminder emotionally of, oh, I need to do exactly what this person wants or else they may not love me, which can be a trauma trigger from parenthood, from childhood, right? From your parenting. It's going to come up and it's going to cause you to repeat whatever it is that you think you need to do to keep the connection. And in that way, you start re-experiencing the exact same emotional story from beginning to end. Instead of it just being the trigger is the same, now the trigger is the same. And so your reaction has been similar. And as a result of that, now you're going through similar motions and similar storylines with yourself. So even though it felt true when you were single that you deserve to take care of yourself and your feelings matter, if you get into a close dynamic with somebody where you re-experience the controlling behavior, that belief of, well, I guess in order to get love, I just have to put myself second. I guess I don't matter, right? It can come creeping right back in because you're not really being thoughtful about why it is that you're feeling the way you're feeling. You feels like it's because of your partner, right? But if you were to step back, you'd notice that when I feel out of control the way that I did with my mom or with my dad, I start to feel like I don't matter because what I feel like I need to do is give up my needs and give up my wants and all my emotional reality so that they'll love me, right? That is a traumatic experience the first time, and you about to make it happen a second time or a third time, right? We can recreate trauma stories for ourselves. So if you've ever been through something with your parents, with a lover, with a sibling, anybody, even classmates, that feels like it just happened yesterday, even though it happened years ago, then that's usually our red flag for, okay, then that's a traumatic experience for you. If you could go back to it that quick, the emotions of it, the feeling of it, the memory of it that quick, then that means that it lived with you in your body, right? So our definition for trauma applies. You experience something and now you're still feeling some type of way at the reminders. That means it was traumatic enough for you that you could really sort of qualify to go into a lot of different therapies, including EMDR, and resolve some of that automatic trigger that happens, because it's really not about here and now. It's about back then, what you were experiencing. And so you're not going to do what makes the most sense for here and now. You're going to do what made the most sense when it happened the first time, right? And having that insight that, yes, I'm re-experiencing the emotions, oftentimes can kind of calm the body down, right? Like if it's the anniversary of a really traumatic event. Oh, that's right, because today is the day when I lost so-and-so is a lot easier to experience than why the hell do I feel so terrible today? Which is also why for some of us, this might be an exercise that you need to do with yourself, which is take note of days or times of years where you know there's been a really big change, upheaval, loss, traumatic event, violence that has happened to you. Take note of when that is. So that way when, and do it in your phone calendar, wherever you're going to be able to see it when it comes up. So that way when those days come up, if you notice yourself feeling irritable, checked out, panicky, having nightmares, being sort of too worried about the situations that are going on or feeling depressed, right? That you can actually go, oh, wait, this is also the same time that this happened to me when I was 18, right? And so maybe I'm actually just re-experiencing the same thing. For example, I experienced a lot of losses between the end of Valentine's Day and Easter. And so the end of February, early March for me tends to be a shut-off period. And I didn't actually realize this for a really long time. I would just sort of go and I'd be like, oh, this is so great, Valentine's Day is coming up. And all of a sudden I would crash and I wouldn't know what was happening, but I'd assign it to a lot of different things. But later when I started learning about trauma, I realized, no, it actually doesn't matter where I am. If I don't acknowledge it, I still feel bad, right? Because the end of February, early March for me was filled with death and loss and me being out of control of my body and my parents going through their own traumas. And so, yeah, that 3-week span for me is going to be rough. right? And so I need to really build in some sort of preventive measure, given that I'm going to be foggy and I'm not going to feel good. What do I need before that even happens, right? And so re-experiencing when we know that it might happen is something we can actually plan for and have compassion for ourselves and say, if I know that every March 4th, right, I get a reminder of my friend that I lost, how am I going to honor that friend? How am I going to honor myself? What would it look like to say, yes, this is going to remind me of it, and I'm taking ownership of the fact that this is an emotional experience I had, right? Because that starts to get the trauma out of it. Which brings us to sort of the other part of this that makes that hard, what I'm talking about now, which is avoidance of reminders. And reminders can be a lot of things, y'all. Reminders can be stuff that we're not even consciously thinking about. When it comes to trauma, I've seen people triggered by the temperature of a room, the lighting, the breath of somebody, the buzzing of fluorescent lighting. I mean, it can be anything that triggers it. And so when we're in close relationships with people, sometimes we'll be like, oh, they triggered me, and it seems so obvious, right? But what if, right, it's beyond just what people are saying or doing. If it's, I don't like mornings, right? Because in the morning, that's when my dad used to bust into my room and, do all this stuff to me. Well, then, yeah, that's going to make it so that your body's actually going to want to avoid the feeling in the morning, right? Or if night times are a really bad sight for me because I always went to bed and then somebody came into my room, what am I going to do there? And so things that are really about avoiding the reminders of a pattern, they become a part of our lives when we're traumatized. We just try to avoid the reminders altogether. And so it can feel good for us to just avoid all of this stuff, right? I don't go there anymore because that reminds me of this. And sometimes that's not a big deal, but this can get to a level where it's really disruptive, right? If I can't go to school anymore because when I was in school, somebody bullied me, and now every school triggers me. That happens to a lot of kids, by the way. Then we're talking about a trauma that has to be dealt with, or else this kid's just going to be getting overwhelmed or punished for it, right? And for a lot of people, punishment for their trauma symptoms is a very real thing, because something like checking out from your body with dissociation in school, oh, they don't like to see that. Did you hear what I said? I was just talking to you. You were spacing out. That can be a really rough thing to have happen. Avoidance of a reminder of a place that makes you feel belittled or hurt or vulnerable, that can be really dangerous when school's full of people who are yelling and screaming and creating rules for you, right? And it can also be difficult at work when people might remind you of your parents, or remind you of an ex, or remind you of somebody who, has really betrayed you before, or situations that have set you up for failure, right? And so the last part of PTSD as symptoms are simply panic. Panic is something that does not always have to be a part of it. Just like none of these by themselves mean that you have PTSD. All of them might mean you have trauma symptoms, but none of them by themselves mean that you have PTSD, right? And so panic can be panic attacks. It can also just be really extreme anxiety and worry that something is imminent, that it's doomed, you're dreading this thing happening, even though there's no real evidence around you that it's going to happen for sure. This is just what your perceived reality is, right? And so one of the hardest things about trauma is that it makes things feel real because they were. And so if you're watching this and you're kind of wondering, okay, so now we've gone through all of this and I'm realizing maybe I do have some trauma symptoms, that maybe I have been through something that has stayed in my body and has me feeling some type of way about reminders of it. Something as simple as saying, all women lie or all men cheat, right? Is a really simple way of kind of saying, I am hypervigilant about the possibility of being betrayed in this way. And it also represents generational, perhaps, messaging about trauma and pain and hurt and loss, right? And so when we're talking about addressing trauma, something that we have to do, and as a Black community is almost pivotal that we do, and as Indigenous people, it's also pivotal that people do, is to address that some of the things that we went through, we coped with the best that we could in the context that we were given. And this is true of a lot of our grandparents and parents. The situation ain't easy. They're doing the best that they can with checking out and being worried and panicking about symptoms repeating and things repeating to try to live their life and survive. And so for us, as a generation, we get this weird, unique opportunity to be triggered with enough information and enough sort of insight into what has happened to start to say, maybe I want to cope better. And what we can do for our children and for the people who come after us and for our communities is to start to model what coping looks like that isn't just survival, but that's focused on being more of all of who we are as our authentic self without fear of what's going to happen if we do that, right? Because what's really traumatic about being a Black person or an Indigenous person in America is that if you really are all of who you are, history in hand, family stuff in hand, values in hand, spirituality in hand, that if you're all of that, that there's going to be a backlash to your identity for just existing. And so to be able to feel safe, to exist as that whole person, it's a very difficult journey, and it absolutely is a journey of healing trauma because we have been injected with messages of racism, sexism, homophobia, white supremacy, imperialism, right? And so we really, really need to be careful because what all of that stuff gets off on is that it's going to be so dangerous for you to challenge the system that you don't. And so a lot of us are going through life hypervigilant about things like police officers, and we don't know what to do about it. But what we should know is if everybody in our community is walking around hypervigilant about police, that systemically they have caused harm to the degree that it constitutes trauma, right? So hopefully, as you're sitting here today, you've been able to recognize whether or not some of these things apply to you. You've been able to sort of understand what trauma is in a little bit more of a specific way so that you could actually figure out if someone around you is traumatized and could benefit from trauma therapies, right? And then last but absolutely not least, hopefully what can come out of this is some self-awareness and some insight into if something ever does happen here, that something is going on that can be addressed, right? Wisdom of what's going on with you, of what your emotions mean, of what your story is and what it adds up to, it helps us cope. And so just knowing that there's somewhere to start where, oh, something has traumatized me, that's the first step. The question then becomes, well, what am I going to do about it, right? And so emotionally, intelligently, what we want to try to do is first recognize what we feel, then recognize what it means, and then figure out what we need and how to get it. And so when it comes to trauma, that's a much more complicated journey because the memories are not straightforward. And the more trauma you have, the more complicated the memories become, right? We can't even remember the order, if you can imagine. If you're a person who doesn't have a lot of trauma, it probably sounds weird to think you wouldn't be able to remember when things happened or how old you were or in what order. But if you're a person who's been moved around a lot, had a lot of safety issues, experienced a lot of really crazy chaos, you probably do have some trouble remembering things. And that is absolutely normal for that kind of experience. So for today, we're going to draw a card to end off this kind of heavy but necessary info session on trauma and what that really is and what that looks like. If you are experiencing trauma and your body's been a site of harm, one of the things that I encourage you to do is start to figure out where your safety lies and build as much of it into your life as you possibly can, whether it's friendships or activities or places or vacations. Try your best to make sure that you are taking care of the side of you that doesn't feel triggered and traumatized so that you can come back with the capacity to handle what you need to handle with your triggers feeling a little further away. So as I'm picking a card here, shuffling, got the Devil card. And so this is the Devil card right side up. This is the light Devil card. So it actually doesn't necessarily mean anything terrible. All it means is that there is temptation to go to the darker sides of ourselves, to the darker thoughts, to the darker habits, to the darker places. And so if you think of the 7 deadly sins, right, that's what this card kind of represents, being tempted by lust, by fear, by gluttony, by all this unhealthy coping that can kind of come into our lives. But the message of a Devil card that's right side up is that you have the ability to choose to keep both your freedom for life and your joy and your passions and all the sort of good things that come along with really giving in to some of those impulses. But if you go too extreme in either direction, if you go too extreme in the direction of not taking care of yourself, not looking at yourself, not kind of being fun, playful, and grounded, then you obviously sort of head into some sort of hedonism and debauchery and kind of a life that's off balance. We don't want to get lost. And this is very common with trauma in things like substance abuse or things like coping with sex or busyness to avoid feeling, right? But then also on the other hand of this, if we're going so deep into the emotionality that we just keep replaying it and trying to figure out how to fix ourselves, right? That seriousness around it, that focus on it, that's not helpful either, right? So we want to get in balance the parts of ourselves that feel dark, that feel like they're being tempted into the stuff that really isn't good for us, that really scares us, right? And so when we respond with things like rage, or when we respond with things like overeating or overly controlling situations, it's a time for us to really start looking at, is this a trauma response? Is this a memory for me of a habit that helped me cope with something that still makes me feel some type of way, right? And so if that's what's happening, what our devil card reminds us is that there is absolutely nothing wrong with your instincts. There's absolutely nothing wrong with the feelings that you feel. And we need to keep in balance coping with a healthy coping, right? And experiencing with not over kind of putting yourself in situations that feel overwhelming or triggering or re-traumatizing, right? So the balance is taking care of myself, but not getting so indulgent with the self-care that I start numbing out, self-medicating, or being harmful, right? And that's so common in trauma. So try to deal with your trauma in a way that feels like it clears out the wound and helps it heal again. Most trauma therapy is both painful and rewarding. And that's because that's what trauma is, right? To go back to it is hard, but to get over it is something that frees us from a whole lifetime of sort of being anchored down by something that happened to us that we can't control. So remember that you have an inner set of temptations and lusts and automatic obsessions and negative things that can come up, and memories and thoughts. They don't have to be all that you are, but they are a part of you, right? If we don't acknowledge that, then we're going to be a slave to the things that have happened to us in the past, because we are just letting them control and obsess and go around in our mind uncontrolled, right? The devil card reminds us to sort of not deny our dark side, address it, cope with it, deal with it, healthy, right? Because when we deny it, it shows up somewhere else anyway. It shows up anyway. All right, y'all. I hope that you have a trauma-free rest of your week, and I will see you right back here on People Always Ask on Young Boss Media. Stay beautiful, and hopefully get you whatever you need to feel safe, protected, and like America, and continuing to traumatize your ass. All right? See you next time.